So, hello and welcome to another series of podcasts. This time more on the recruitment rather than career transition and support side, with which we're calling Recruitment 2.0. For this first introductory session, I'm delighted to be joined by Kim Farrell, Director of Wavelength, to discuss new and innovative recruitment processes and provision in the advent of coronavirus, and the impact of ED&I, of equality, diversity and inclusion support going forward. Prior to specialising in people resourcing and recruitment, Kim qualified and worked as an accountant for one of the big four firms, and went on to found various high growth businesses from scratch, of which I'm pleased to say Wavelength is one. Obviously I'm Chris Wright, and I completed my Masters in Human Resource Management, as many of you will know, in September 2018, and went on to found my current consultancy, Talman HR, which specialises in what I'll refer to this point onwards as ED&I, provision and talent management. So the first episode will discuss ED&I in a business and recruitment context and where we want to get to as a business community. So welcome, Kim, and
thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me on.
Okay, we'll get going with a few questions. I don't know whether you want to just intertwine some of yours. So perhaps what we'll do is we'll do one for you, one for me, one for you,
sure,
etc. Particularly on this first one.
Yeah, no worries.
So obviously, Wavelength is a sort of is a recruitment, I would say, disruptor, thankfully.
Yeah.
And it's advertised as the recruitment solution for ambitious businesses.
That's correct.
So can you therefore explain the Wavelength approach to any viewers and listeners, and how it is likely to differ from traditional recruitment models?
Sure. So as you said in your introduction, we've come at this problem of recruiting and finding good people for your team from the perspective of employers and people who've worked in companies or run companies where we're growing. And the biggest, if you're trying to achieve anything and trying to achieve any growth or trying to realize your vision, recruiting the right people is obviously a massive part of that journey you're going on. And essentially what we found is, and really where we've sort of come from with Wavelength, is that people really struggle to find the right people that have a mix of the right value fit, cultural fit, so that everyone's pushing in the same direction. And the reason for that is that because the whole recruitment market is not set up in that way to help you achieve that vision. And the reason is because the biggest metric in recruitment and the biggest predictor that people use for future success in recruitment is previous experience. And that is with the CV and that type of thing. And what you find is, if you look at a CV actually just tells you where someone's worked. And when you put previous experience as one of your top criteria, what you're actually doing is you're massively limiting yourselves in terms of the potential that talent that could come into your team, because you as the employer or the recruiter have set this arbitrary number in your head as a benchmark of whether someone's going to be good or not. So, for example, you might say, well, I want someone who's been a salesperson in logistics, so you're setting your industry as well, for 5 years, and if you haven't got that, then I'm not interested in you in your team. Now, and that is the approach effectively that the whole recruitment industry follows. But unfortunately, that is actually one of the worst indicators of whether someone's going to be successful in your team or not. And a study's been done. Gallup did a study a few years ago where effectively a CV or experience-led approach actually you only get it right 25% of the time if you take that approach only. So miss 25% of the time you're getting it right. So that means 3 times out of 4 you will get it wrong if you follow this approach. So, and this is where the whole industry is focused on this sort of experience-led approach. And this is ultimately where Wavelength came about from, because we were struggling with finding these people, and we realized, well, we're following the wrong approach, and the right approach is to focus on, as I said, your value and culture fit. So that's when we talk about ambitious businesses. What we mean is businesses that are looking forward and they're looking to grow, and what they're trying to do is build a diverse team of people with a varied set of skills and attributes, but that ultimately are all going in the same direction. And that is really what is important. So our approach to, and our change to a different recruitment model, is that we focus on the fundamental question, which is, and this is a question that people sometimes forget to ask when they're recruiting, which is, why am I looking for this person, and what are they going to bring into our unique team? And that is not experience. That could be a whole host of different things. So our approach ultimately works with, where we work with our partners, because we very much believe in a partner-led approach, to understand why they're looking for these people, what measure of success that we can use to understand whether it's been the right hire, and then ultimately come up with a criteria that measures the culture, behavioural fit, but also obviously if they've got the ability to do the job. That comes into 4 areas, which I can talk about later. And what we find is, if you focus on that and you set questions that are around, or experiential questions around, how would you react in a situation? What would you do if this happened? What you find is you've massively opened up your potential talent pool of people, and you're finding people from completely different backgrounds, different industries, all sorts of different people, but everyone is believing in the same thing and going in the same direction as your business. And what we find is that approach, you get it right 3 times out of 4. So they're going wrong 3 times out of 4. And then you couple that with a systematic approach, which is unbiased. So again, the interesting thing about recruitment is that people don't have any training in it, and everyone recruits or has been involved in recruitment in some way or another, whether as a candidate looking for a position or as someone who's actually on the other side recruiting. We all do it, but none of us have any sort of training in it. And what happens is, again, is you end up with this this sort of not systematic approach. It can become biased because you hired the person that you like rather than the person who's necessarily the best for the job. And what happens is, so our approach is very much geared to setting criteria that is unbiased, and everyone is grading against the same criteria. And then we take you on a journey right the way through from start to finish. And ultimately, that's why we can get it right 3 times out of 4 rather than wrong 3 times out of 4.
Absolutely. And I think there is a need, as we always say within Talman HR as well, with our inclusion and talent approach, to value all talent wherever it comes from, and that level of depth and breadth is also very important. At the risk of sounding slightly too innovative, possibly, I think there are a number of pitfalls with the traditional approach, as you say, which leads to organizations effectively creating clones. And that's not just clones of people or of professionals, rather. It's also clones of the previous job role. I read some research, must have been 2 or 3 years ago now, but it's still pertinent, that effectively said that essentially most organizations are recruiting for roles that are 10 years old. So essentially they're 10 years out of date. They haven't actually looked at where their business is going, and developing and looking into these people resourcing, HR, talent considerations in conjunction with the wider business strategy, which is where, certainly from a Talman HR perspective, and I know that Wavelength would concur with this, we start and look at it from a strategic perspective, rather than saying strategic at the top, but more strategy as an all-encompassing way of working.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Considerations.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's why the first question as we ask is, why are you recruiting for this role, or what problem or challenge are you trying to solve while recruiting this role? Because actually what is quite interesting is that people will say, right, I need to, like I said, replace this role, or I need to recruit someone, without actually having fully thought through what problem or challenge are they trying to solve in their business going forward. As you said, from a strategic point of view, it's more of a firefighting problem resolution rather than a strategic view. And so, and sometimes what we find is that the role will change because they're looking forward rather than looking at, oh no, I've got a problem I need to solve. So absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, Kim, do you want to, if you want to go in with the next question, which I know leads nicely on to from what we've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. So, do you see businesses considering cultural and value fit to be a huge driver of performance more than they used to? And is this being considered from an HR perspective?
I think that that's an interesting question, and still quite unclear, unfortunately. There's lots of talk about it on social media and other rhetoric, and I'm sure that there are a number of organisations that are actually taking this forward. But I think that the organisations that put it into practice and those that don't are too. We've kind of moved ourselves into two extremes. Mm-hmm. So essentially, culture as a value of performance often depends on the culture and the ethos of the organisation, rather than just are people considering it. Because if you and it depends on which sector you're in. If you're in sort of either public sector or smaller organisations with fairly stringent requirements legally in terms of various protocols, then you're more likely to have a traditional narrower view, because that's where the strategic aim of the organisation or the team is, and it might be right for that sector. So I think that culture and value and performance varies according to context, but I do think it's being considered more than it used to be, and I've actually just picked out. I came across an article. I won't say where it's from, obviously, for various reasons. But it's in a leading HR people publication that essentially talks about disputes arising from COVID-19 and other COVID-19 considerations. And I think there's a useful point on the back, and this was largely talking about legal issues, but it was beginning to talk about prioritizing employee engagement and cultural fit. So I think there's a beginnings of a synergy between the sort of traditional policy and legal-based perspectives, and actually moving forward into a more strategic-led approach because with COVID-19 as a catalyst.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think certainly that's what we see. And the interesting thing with culture and values is that a lot of companies, and certainly companies I've been involved with, you're obviously growing organically, and as I was saying a minute ago, is that when you're recruiting, or certainly when you're bringing people into your team, you're not thinking about what team are we creating here? What are we creating, and where are we going with this team? So, and I think this is one of the problems or challenges with sort of the way we've all traditionally gone about recruitment, is that culture and value fit is so important, but people certainly, and this is certainly something what we've been guilty of in the past, is that we didn't have a clear set of values that everyone bought into, or we didn't have a clear direction that everyone involved in the team knew where they were going, that everyone knew where they were going. And even I think if an interesting thing maybe for some of the people watching or listening to do would be to think about, if you walked around your business and asked people what are the values of this company, it'd be interesting to see what their answers would be, because certainly we work with some big companies, small companies, and everything in between, and you'd be very probably not surprised that even that some very well-established companies don't have a clear, defined set of values that everyone's bought into, that are genuine and authentic.
Absolutely, and I think the authenticity is very important, and actually, as I say, following things through just from the initial rhetoric. I think in one previous business call, Kim, recently, we laughed and said, well, there's a difference between putting this stuff into practice and having various values pinned up on a pinboard in the office.
Yeah.
And I think that more organizations, whether large or small, need to start looking into this area, because I mean, if you look at just coming back to COVID as an example for viewers and listeners, if you think we've really moved into a more flexible pattern of work, which is something I'll probably discuss a bit later, but also in terms of the ever-changing statutory guidance in relation to COVID, means that there is less clarity and more fluidity in terms of the way people are approaching things and interpreting things. And while obviously that's a change, a disruptor, and can be quite challenging in certain contexts, I think that it does represent a chance to move forward and integrate some of these key issues a little bit more, rather than just seeing them as separate, or for someone with more previous experience to take on. Yeah,
definitely. Again, I think COVID's been interesting because it's pushed forward things that were probably 5 to 10 years down the line are becoming more have been pushed forward into people's minds today because they have to. And I think obviously it's been a challenging time for everyone and a lot of businesses. But I do think people are now opening up to the idea of actually, yeah, people can work flexibly. People can be in different locations. People can, work to a different time frame and still be effective. And ultimately, the thing that's going to make that a reality is value fit. Because if you believe in the same thing as everyone's pushing in the same direction as your team, as in the team, then it doesn't matter where you're based or what you're doing or how you're operating, because you've got a set of rules and guidelines that you all follow as a team. And that's why it's so important to have those at the core of everything you do.
Absolutely, Kim, I completely agree. Wonderful examples and well put there. So I guess we've begun to discuss this in our initial questions, but it might just be worth looking into very briefly.
Sure.
In your view, what needs to change for recruitment to become more effective?
So the primary thing is that people, for recruitment to become effective, as I said earlier on, is moving away from the old sort of way of working around previous experience. But interestingly, the whole market is set up around this. So that there's essentially three players in the recruitment market. So there's the agency. So there's the recruitment agency that we'll know and have experience of, whether that be good or bad. And there's 27,000 recruitment agencies in the UK, which shows the size of the market. And what the whole agency model built up around a relationship with a candidate and a relationship with an employer. So, and what that means is you're essentially conflicted in your relationship because you're acting for two different groups. And as an agency, you get paid when one of your candidates comes into your employer. So you're effectively you're biased, because inherently biased, because you're acting for two distinct parties. So, and then your means of the way that you find the people is by one was originally building relationships with candidates, but now more and more often is advertising using the second player in the recruitment space, which is a job board, job website, and those would be examples of, you know, Indeed, Reed, Monster, those guys. And these players have been around, and probably that was the last big shake-up industry probably 20 years ago. And interestingly, their whole model is around registering candidates onto their site, so candidates put in their CVs, and then employers and recruitment agencies. I mean, 85% of recruitment agencies placements come from advertising through job boards, which is an interesting stat when you look at it. So 85% of their placements come through job boards. Now, job boards are built up around you as an employer going on and essentially advertising your own role, and then people applying through with their CVs. Or the other way you can do it is by filtering through the registered CVs of people that have registered on their site. And what that means is the tools that we're using is, one is you're advertising to people who are have essentially done some work that tells a story of where they've worked over the past few years. So there's no set criteria that relating to the employer's specific job. The second thing is you've got CVs on there or people who might have not been engaged, and essentially you're cold contacting people, cold saying, do you want this job? And this is what agencies or even employers are doing when you're going through this the job board approach. And then you have agencies who are in a conflicted position, and everyone is no one knows what, as I said, no one has any training in this. So if you go and look on websites for job websites or agency websites, they'll just assume that you know what you're doing and know what you're looking for. And that is ultimately what needs to change in the recruitment market. And what needs to change in the recruitment market is to go back to what we were talking about before, is why am I looking for this particular role? And what is it outside of experience that I can use to understand whether this particular person is going to be the right fit for my team? And then how can I communicate, once I've understood what it is I'm looking for, why I'm looking for them, how can I communicate out to these people so that they will want to come and apply for my particular position, not being coerced or being cold contacted? And that's ultimately what needs to change. And there's essentially four things that you can do to look at, and experience being the least important one of them. So the first one is, do they have the right attitude and value fit to fit in with your unique team and culture? That's the most important thing. The second one is, do they have the right level of motivation to succeed in your business? So will they fit in values wise with what you're doing, your culture? And then are they motivated to succeed in your team? The third one is, can they perform in your particular working environment? So everyone's environment is different. So if your environment is loud, busy, and it's bustling, and someone doesn't want to operate in that sort of environment, then that's not right fit for you. And then the last one is, do they have the ability to succeed in a job? As in, do they have the ability to be able to do the job? That's probably the least important factor, because you can train. You can train people. Most people have been trained. I mean, I'm sitting here talking about recruitment, coming from a accounting background originally, and I mean, you must do this all the time. You're interested to hear your perspective on that. Is that if you measure those four things, then you will get, and you set questions and criteria around those four areas, you will have a much higher success rate than you would using the traditional method. And that's ultimately our methodology. You need to understand what that is, and then you set out a clear process that everyone involved in the recruitment process, and this is where recruitment can go wrong as well, is where not everyone in the recruitment process has agreed to the same criteria. And what will happen there is everyone must agree. If the person fits this criteria, then we will speak to them and we will grade them in an unbiased way. And ultimately, the best person will come out of that process at the end of it. So that's ultimately what we think needs to change to make recruitment more effective. And that's certainly our approach anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure will be very useful to viewers and listeners. What I would say is that this also links in with our within our inclusion and talent approach quite well, because if you actually narrow down your pool to the extent that a lot of businesses seem to do so, and I apologise to any viewers and listeners if you don't feel that you're in this category, but I'm just using it as an example, where if you include family-friendly policies, the rate of diversity consideration, or the level, increases to 78%.
Wow.
So if you're not thinking about broadening your talent pool, having those inclusive leadership behaviours, a good level of culture, and sort of team cohesion, as Kim and I have been discussing this morning, then you're really missing out on what I like to call return on innovation. And that's not just return on investment in hard numbers. It's actually how innovative can you be, how, how integrated and creative can your team be to move the business forward, which in these times of significant uncertainty, if organizations are to survive, is probably going to be the number one or at least a top 5 consideration for a lot of businesses going forward.
No, definitely.
I think even the NHS have said that in terms of IT and in terms of management practices, they've moved forward by about 20 years. I
Wow.
In one report, and that's obviously a UK example. But also within our inclusion and talent approach, and you'll be able to read this on our website. So failing to address these issues based on obviously practical insights can reduce innovation potential by up to 40%. So that's around the ROI, the other I rather than investment. Yep. Reduce business interest from customers by up to £1.8 billion across the UK economy annually, and that may well increase beyond that, given various economic circumstances at the moment. But addressing these issues should avoid 75% of inclusion in talent consumers moving business elsewhere if their service providers do not accommodate their needs sufficiently. So that's more of a marketing-based thing, but I'll explain why later. And 83% of workers leaving their employer because they fail to understand their needs, let alone the potential litigation and discrimination and equality-related legal considerations that you may be uncovering like a can of worms there, some of which are uncapped depending on various protected characteristics. But I'd just like to talk about that first solution I've come across in terms of accommodating the needs of service provision generally, both for consumers and employees or workers. And that is the fact that if you think about an employer branding approach, which is something we very much like to advocate, those consumers that are outside of the door looking in the window one day or looking online in most cases now, could actually end up coming to work for you in the not too distant future. So being able to communicate those values, have a good level of customer service, and actually be appreciative on both sides of the sort of a worker, a consumer equation is actually quite important.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one of the things I was going to want to ask you was, in your experience, how many businesses have clearly defined out values that everyone in the team buys into? And do they use this as part of their appraisal or management process? Because you obviously talked about people leaving because they didn't feel like they were, part of the team. So do you see that? How many businesses do you think have that clearly set out and actually are using it as part of their appraisal and management process?
Very few businesses actually disclose the way they're doing it.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the problem with significant HR or people-led interventions that actually sort of work on an analytical perspective is that, and again, apologies for being slightly jarring here, is that there is a tendency to, if you're not careful and if you don't have that open culture and great fit that you've been discussing, Kim, is to push any major problem under the carpet. So a lot of organizations, and I've attended a lot of webinars recently, including with some fairly large consultancies, and they all provide I have to say there is some progress. They're beginning to provide wonderful stats on the outcomes that they've had with these super duper management processes and strategies that they've put forward and various other programs. But without actually having that additional data tranche that says this is how we've come to that conclusion, how on earth are you supposed to determine whether it's going to be effective? And this is something I found when I was studying for my master's qualification in a number of different contexts. That until you actually work out how you came to that conclusion, the data is not necessarily meaningless, but it has a significant limitation, because what one person views, or what one person or organization or team views as performance or a good value, maybe someone else's idea of a poor performance, disastrous value, etc., etc. So I think that and I'm sure you'll agree with this, Kim, any major change, transformation program, etc., etc., has got to be backed up by, number one, data, and number two, and I have to say they are equal, but I'm just numbering them, a good level of cultural fit, where everybody, certainly within the key players within the team or the organization, have agreed on the route forward and the way in which their team or organization is operating. That sort of cultural paradigm.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And this is why it's so important that companies need to recognize that they are unique, and that if you, and this is why sort of going back to, without retreading our ground too much, is why if you follow that approach of experience or a CV-led approach, just because someone's been worked in a different company and they've done this particular job doesn't mean they're going to do it well in your particular company and do it well in your job. And that's why it's massively, and I think what certainly what you're talking about there, and some of the stats that I've seen, I mean, there's Gallup did a survey a few years back, and they found that 89% of people are unhappy or very unhappy in their work, which is quite a, it's a terrible statistic. But I think that comes down to the fact that people are doing jobs or hiring jobs, and it's not looking at their culture or value, or the value fit for their team. So I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, and you do need the data certainly to measure that and back that up. Absolutely.
Okay. Another question then for you, Kim. You mentioned to me a couple of times, and I love this analogy of location, location, location in a recruitment context. Can you just explain for the uninitiated what that actually is and how it's effective? And just to say that there is no confusion between the popular UK television program.
It's a good analogy. Yeah, I mean, we say it. So location, Kirsty and Phil. Location, location, location. They go into the house, and they're showing the people around, and they go, "Oh, this is my home. This is where I want to be." And that's what sadly people forget when they're looking for people for their team. They go out there with right. We've been trading for 50 years. We do this. And they start coming out with all this corporate jargon. I think it's. I don't know if it's fear or nervous. Also, the way we've always done it, so we should talk like this. And what that means is the people that you could be attracting to your team that could be great are not not interested because you sound like a Victorian league solicitor or something, because that's not your business. So when we talk about that analogy is because I think it brings home to people to be genuine and authentic with when they talk about their environment and their team and what they're about. So again, this is something that we work on very much with our partners, is that you're advertising as an employer, you're advertising for someone to come and work and be part of your team and spend the majority of their week in your environment with you and the other people in your team. And if you can't communicate that in an effective and genuine way that is targeted at the person who's going to be potentially working with you, then you're not going to find people. You're not going to find the right people. So as I said, very much those 4 characteristics I talked about earlier, you need to back that up with who you work with. In adverts, we work with partners. So you'll be working with Kim and a small team of 4. We're an integral part of the business. We have fun together. You need to humanize the business, and that's the Kirsty and Phil scenario. Do you smell the bread when you go in, or the fresh coffee? Do you know that type of thing? That's the genuine stuff that makes the difference between you finding someone who could be great and someone completely ignoring your job advert. Again, when we recruit, we're expected to be masters of advertising when we're not. But the key in advertising, certainly in a previous business we worked in, was around advertising, is that you've got to be focused at your customer, and your customer is the person who might be joining your team, and people aren't interested in, of course they don't want to know what you do, but they can go on your website and find that out. They can do that. What they really want to know is, what's it like in the team? Are they going to value me and what I bring to the team? Are they going to develop me? Are they going to train me? And particularly with younger people, using a cliche, millennials, but it's not so much just younger people now, but people struggle with that. But what millennials are looking for, younger people are looking for, is to feel like they're part of something and they're going somewhere and they're valued part of the team. And that is really essentially what we mean by that. And that analogy, I think, turns people to go, oh yeah, I see what you're talking about. So that's what that is.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think we do have a tendency to overcomplicate things.
Oh yeah.
And we need to start thinking about the simple solutions first,
Yeah.
and then moving forward to make sure that those more complicated elements and, dare I say, processes, which is something that I hate. I much prefer things to be purpose and outcomes led. But to make sure that those critical processes that you do have to implement are actually tailored to the needs of the organization. And this is something that I often talk about with clients when they say, well, what would you advise, or what solutions can you bring? And I always say, to start with, I need to understand the context of your business and what your problems are from a basic perspective first, because how am I going to then be able, otherwise, if you don't do this, how am I going to be able to provide something that is actually effective and what you need and is value for money for your organization?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It's really interesting. Certainly, one of our values is clarity, is providing clarity, and that is keeping things simple. And that's what people want to know. You don't talk to your friends or colleagues in this way, but for some reason, when people start advertising their business, or if you look at a lot of websites as well, it's really difficult to understand what the company even does. But ultimately, it's people are dealing with people, and that's what. And we don't talk like that. So you shouldn't talk like that when you're communicating that your job to people. It should be genuine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you had one sort of final one for me, Kim, if you want to ask it.
Yeah, sure. So what challenges do you see employers implementing the approach we've been talking about in their teams?
I think it's several-fold. I think it's an ability and an understanding and a willingness in times of difficulty, because I'm relating a lot of this to a COVID context for understandable reasons, because the world of work and the future of work has definitely changed. But a willingness to actually take this forward and think outside the box, and actually think in simplistic terms first, in terms of what I would always start with organizations and say, what's your people requirements in terms of your job requirements, person job fit, and the organization fit for people? Where does your organization want to go? And then designing your people and your HR processes, your HR systems, all the cultural stuff, the lovely values and other fantastic soft stuff around it to be the value. But the strategy has got to be, the general strategic management side of things has got to be the value driver, and the value driver has to link in to what to what the HR and the people function is doing, not the other way around.
Yeah, no, that sounds, I couldn't agree more.
And as I say, just around the diversity side of things, again, thinking outside the box, being open and inclusive, taking people's experience, and this is where previous experience is a good thing, but using those previous experiences in a positive way to try and either preempt and plan forward ahead of problems arising, or to use those experiences to make sure that we can move the business forward in a better, more productive, more cohesive way than we otherwise would have been able to by perhaps being less open and inclusive. But above all, don't complicate things.
Yeah, no, I think you raised a good point there, which is about previous experience being good. We are absolutely not saying don't discount previous experience. What we're saying is previous experience can come from a variety of different backgrounds, and that's the important part of it. Is that but not to restrict yourself and they must have that experience. It's actually people have got a huge wealth of experience across the board, and that's absolutely critical. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll probably come on to the idea of previous experience in the next episode. So I'll leave our further comments for that one. But anyway, thank you, Kim, for joining me on this first episode, and I'm sure, and I would hope that viewers and listeners will enjoy our second episode coming shortly, when we discuss procedural changes and reasonable adjustments, but in a more strategic and practical way, but also blending the obvious legal pointers that we need to bring forward. So I look forward to a further discussion.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me on, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.